I want to just take a few moments to talk about my bill. I talked to the chairman. He's given me a little discretion, which is basically as cybersecurity is, I believe, the most significant and universal threat that every company, enterprise in this country faces. And it's going to get worse. And it's not just a threat to the bottom line of companies, it is a national security threat. I serve on the Armed Services Committee as a ranking member. I was stunned when we had General McDew, who is commander of Transportation Command. Transportation Command is the major agency in DOD that contracts with all the aircraft, all the ships, all the logistical to move men and material and personnel into the war zone to any place in the world. And here's what General McDew said. Cyber is the #1 threat to the U.S. Transportation Command, but I believe it is the #1 threat to the nation. In our headquarters, cyber is the commander's business, but not everywhere across our country is cyber a CEO's business. In our cyber roundtables, which is one of the things we are doing to raise our level of awareness, some of the CEOs, chief security officers, cannot even get to see the board. They cannot even see the CEO. So that is a problem. And the essence of this legislation, which is the mildest form of disclosure, it is not mandatory, it does not require a person to be on the board with a cyber degree. It asks the company in 2 lines to describe what they're doing. We have companies today that we will depend upon in an emergency that may have been fully infiltrated by a cyber threat and they're completely unaware, and their CEOs are unaware, because there's nothing to make them sit down and say, hey, I got to pay attention to cyber. This as First Coast Guy, is the mildest form. When they read that proxy statement, they say, oh yeah, boy, we really have to think about cyber. Otherwise, it won't happen. It's not happening. That's why you have Equifax problems. By the way, it's just announced today that Equifax has settled with state attorney generals. And one of the things they've agreed to do, boost board oversight of cybersecurity, because they failed. And they're not the only company that's failed. And that's failing right now. And we're simply saying, tell your shareholders what you're doing. You can do anything you like. You can hire a company, you can have a director, et cetera. This is not mandatory, this is disclosure. This act is bipartisan. Senator Collins, Senator McCain, Senator Warner, this is something that's absolutely critical. And I should say Senator Warner is the ranking member of the Intelligence Committee, and I think he brings that expertise to this support for this bill also. The Cybersecurity Disclosure Act is supported by not only Professor Coates and Ms. Silvers, thank you, but the Alabama Securities Director, Joseph P. Borg, on behalf of the North American Securities Administrators Association, the National Association of State Treasurers, the California Public Employees Retirement System, the Bipartisan Policy Center, Professor Jack Coffey of Columbia, and the law firm of Kale and L. Gates, which is a very distinguished Washington firm. And I would like who's ever the ranking member to include those letters in the record.
Sure.
Thank you. Thank you, Senator.
Watch out. I'm driving the bus now.
Yeah, okay. So I just think this is just incredibly important. You know, I fear that months, weeks, years from now, there's going to be a cyber disaster, and we're all going to look back and say, gee, if only we had done something. Now it's a chance to do it. Now, Ms. Stuckey, you, in your written testimony, said even the Council of Institutional Investors doesn't subscribe to the view that all boards need a resident cyber expert. Is that correct? Are you aware that the Council of Institutional Investors supports my legislation?
I was not.
Well, you should be.
You're right.
Yes, you should, because your testimony seems a little illogical when you're citing someone criticizing the bill that actually supports it. And in fact, yesterday they sent a letter that said, the Council of Institutional Investors strongly supports the stated goal of the bill to promote transparency in the oversight of cybersecurity risks at publicly traded companies. We are optimistic that S536 may have the potential of being pursued in a thoughtful and bipartisan manner that is responsive to views of investors. So your source is one of my biggest boosters. Thank you. And we make that part of the record too, Mr. Chairman?
Sure.
Thank you. Now, Mr. Quaadman, you have made the point that this effectively mandates a director. That's wrong. This does not. Professor Coates pointed out with his experience not as an attorney but as a practical lawyer. I think it's interesting to note that in February 2018, a report by the Trump Council of Economic Advisors, they said, and I quote, mandatory disclosure requirements were previously shown to incentivize firms to adopt better cybersecurity measures. And that's precisely what we're doing today. So I would hope you would take that back for the record. Professor Coates, you've been listening. Can you comment any further about your views on the bill?
I just to reiterate that the boards in this country are, in my experience, reasonably firm and strong-willed, and if they don't think they need a cyber expert on their board, I don't think this bill, which only requires them to say do they or don't they, and if not, why not, will force them to take one on. I'll note that a similar type of encouragement in Sarbanes-Oxley addressed financial experts. And there are 90 or so New York Stock Exchange companies that still are happy to not have a financial expert on their board, and they'll explain why in their proxy statement. So it's not as if this really does force a one-size-fits-all solution. There are one-size-fits-all solutions, and I really do worry that if there's another Equifax or similar event, we'll end up with a one-size-fits-all regulatory regime. This bill, I would like to think, would head that off. Thank you.
Well, I appreciate that. And again, unfortunately, based on experience, and Senator Cotton and I share our position on the Armed Services Committee and also on the Intelligence Committee. And cybersecurity is something that's not a passing fancy. And as you pointed out previously, Professor Coates, it affects every enterprise in this country. It's not like a labor issue or environmental issue where the company has nothing to do with that, so this would be a waste of their time. Every company, I mean, I look back at some of the big intrusions, the Target intrusion of a few years ago. It was a HVAC contractor who they got in through. In fact, frankly, my sense, if they're coming after us, they won't be right through the front door of companies that are doing all the right things. It'll be the companies that need the reminder to think about cybersecurity. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I would yield my time. Thank you.